Unfortunately for the Soviets and people who were close, General Secretary of the Central Committee, Leonid Brezhnev, has passed away after suffering from cardiac arrest at the age of 75. Born on December 19, 1906, Brezhnev was raised in a small Ukrainian town called Kamensko. Growing up in a civil war, he faced many hardships as a child. At the young age of 15, he had to quit school and begin work. After graduating from a trade school, he shifted his focus towards politics. He then joined the Communist Party and contributed to the effort of Russification. Eventually, he ran for the first secretary of the Central Committee. This led him to joining the Secretariat. When, in 1964, Khrushchev was impeached, Brezhnev took his spot and was later known as General Secretary. From there, he made many of the reforms he is known for today. He will be remembered for all of his many contributions to the Soviet Union and to the people around him. A timeline of his political achievements has been composed in memory. During the time that Brezhnev was in office, a doctrine was created by the Soviets. This policy of preventing European countries under Soviet control from rejecting communism became known as the Brezhnev Doctrine. Once Brezhnev had invaded Czechoslovakia, he needed justification for his actions. Without justification, Brezhnev faced the possibility of getting removed from office and also the possibility of losing popular favor. These possibilities forced Brezhnev to find a means of coming to peace, and this was the birth of the Brezhnev Doctrine. In general, the doctrine stated that in Russia's satellite states, a communist government could not be opposed by other parties or by the people. Another major part of the Brezhnev Doctrine was that it made the states in Soviet Russia unable to leave the Warsaw Pact.
Leonid came into power in 1964 after Khrushchev was impeached due to his loss of favor during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Leonid began creating policies that limited free speech and also censored published works throughout Eastern Europe. When Alexander Dubček loosened speech laws in Czechoslovakia, the country prospered with fresh ideas. This period, known as the Prague Spring, was cut short as Brezhnev and his Warsaw Pact allies stormed Czechoslovakia and restored the censorship. Known as the Brezhnev Doctrine, Leonid's motive to prevent free speech was to keep communism prevalent in socialist countries. He then went on to use the Brezhnev Doctrine as a rationale for invading Hungary on similar grounds to the invasion of Czechoslovakia. His main goal as a leader was to maintain and strengthen the influence of communism in Europe while easing the tension with the US in the middle of the Cold War. Brezhnev largely impacted a couple of years called the Prague Spring. The Prague Spring was a time of economic and ideological growth for Czechoslovakia. Leader Alexander Dubček made many reforms in an attempt to decentralize the economy and allow more freedom of speech. His reforms were successful, and democracy began to become more popular. The cause of Alexander Dubček's reform is largely a result of the Soviet Union bullying the people of Czechoslovakia. This led to demonstrations against censorship and the eventual election of Alexander Dubček as first secretary. Brezhnev felt he had to stop Dubček as his tolerance and spread of democratic ideas threatened the strength of the Soviet Union and its allies. As well as having a positive effect towards the well-being of the Soviet Union, Brezhnev damaged the country. A period of stagnation occurred while Brezhnev was enacting the Brezhnev Doctrine. This was a time of economic downfall caused by lack of political change. Conservative Leonid Brezhnev did not want the Soviet Union to change, so as the global economy shifted, the Soviet Union fell behind, and no reforms were made due to the political stagnation.
Coming up next is an interview between Richard Nixon and our interviewer, Mason Menaker. They will be discussing the long relationship between Nixon and Brezhnev, as well as a talk about the visit Nixon had to Moscow in 1972 for the Moscow Summit. Up now we have Richard Nixon, who met with Brezhnev at the Moscow Summit of 1972. Thank you for joining us, Mr. Nixon. As a longtime ally with Brezhnev, how do you feel learning of his death?
Well, I think that his death is a great loss for the Soviet Union. Brezhnev was a good friend of mine and a good negotiator with the Soviets. It is sad to hear of his passing. Of course, our two governments have been at gunpoint with each other for years, but when a man that I knew well dies, it is still taken as a blow.
I'm sorry to hear that. If it is alright, we would like to ask you a few questions about Leonid Brezhnev and about some of your relations in Russia.
Yes, that's fine.
We know that you were the first United States president to ever set foot in Moscow. What was your greeting like when you arrived?
Well, I was quite glad with how the Soviets welcomed me to their country. Both national anthems were played as well as both of our flags being flown. One thing that surprised me was the fact that Leonid Brezhnev was not actually at the airport to meet me.
During your time in Moscow, the main event was the Moscow summit. Could you explain what happened during this meeting?
Well, the summit took place from May 22nd to May 30th, and during those 8 days there was a lot of discussion and signings between our two governments. The United States signed the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, the First Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, and the U.S.-Soviet Incidents at Sea Agreement. These signings were considered as one of the hallmarks of the detente between the Soviets and the U.S.
When you were in Moscow, we were informed that you had some unscheduled talks with Brezhnev. What did you two discuss during these meetings?
Although Ronner Ziegler, White House press secretary, has said that we discussed international issues, I am unable to disclose the information on what was said and done in those meetings.
Alright. So we have a few final questions for you. First one. So even though you and Brezhnev were war enemies and had opposing governments, were you two still close friends?
Although when we met in Moscow, it was strictly government matters, Brezhnev and I did have a good relationship. After that meeting, some years later, Brezhnev visited me in the White House, where we established sort of a friendship.
The Oval Office recordings that were just recently submitted do show this very well. That's all the time we really have today. Thank you for coming, Mr. Nixon.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so that's it. Thank you once again, and we're done. I want to thank everybody who came today to watch our broadcast, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.